Good evening, my name is Jo Woolf. I'm writer-in-residence at RSGS, and I love finding stories about explorers that are hidden away in the archives, especially when the explorer in question has a direct connection with the society, either through lecturing or receiving a medal or any kind of interesting correspondence. Sometimes you can get an insight that might otherwise have been missed. It just seems to bring you that little bit closer to the people themselves and understand what inspired them to do what they did. So for this talk, I've chosen a number of items to show you, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about their significance and hopefully shed some light on the characters of the people that are attached to them. To start off with, I'm looking at a poster advertising a lecture in the Caird Hall, Dundee, on Friday the 10th of February. Although it doesn't give a year, this is 1922, almost exactly 100 years ago. The lecture is entitled The Mount Everest Expedition, and the speaker is Mr. George Mallory. George Mallory, as you may know, was and still is an iconic name in the world of mountaineering, and this is one lecture I would love to have attended. The poster says the lecture is given on behalf of the Mount Everest Committee. It was a fundraising lecture to help support a forthcoming expedition to Everest. It says, the narrative will be illustrated by a large number of lantern slides from most remarkable and very beautiful photographs taken on the expedition. And by that, of course, they mean the reconnaissance expedition, which had already taken place in 1921. On the back of the poster is a photo of Mallory looking very youthful. He was about 34 at the time. So to put this into context, the Mount Everest Committee had been formed after the First World War with the aim of organising a British expedition to get to the summit of Everest, to be the first. The committee's chairman was Sir Francis Younghusband, who incidentally received the RSGS Gold Medal in 1905. Younghusband said, "The committee will not admit that there is any spot on the Earth's surface on which a British man should not at least try to set his foot." So with that stirring thought in mind, they started to gather a team of Britain's most talented mountaineers. And the first thing they did was to send out a reconnaissance expedition in 1921. This was led by Charles Howard Berry, and George Mallory was one of the team. Mallory was a teacher at Charterhouse School in Surrey, and he was also a fabulously talented climber. The main purpose was to discover the best route up the mountain, but they also made geological and botanical surveys, and they were drawing maps. It was a huge physical challenge. They had to make a trek of 300 miles across the Tibetan plateau just to get there. Mallory recorded his first impressions of Everest. He said it was a great, bluntly pointed snow peak with a much steeper north face than people have made out, the most stupendous ridges and appalling precipices that I have ever seen. All the talk of easy snow slopes is a myth. But Mallory was one of those climbers who could always find a way up a mountain, and they managed to work out a route to the summit. Although it was just a reconnaissance expedition, they did actually get as far as the North Col, and then they had to turn back because of the weather. They returned to Britain, and a follow-up expedition was planned for 1922, which would be a proper bid to climb Everest. They were going to make a start in March of that year, but beforehand, in the February, Mallory came to talk to RSGS groups in Edinburgh, Aberdeen, and Dundee. The Aberdeen Free Press reported on the event, and here's the news cutting. Mallory was described as being quite boyish in appearance, and he was modesty itself regarding his part in the expedition. The article said, but the pictures, even more than the graphic words, brought home the magnificent task which the mountaineers faced. Probably no more awesome yet fascinating and inspiring series of photographs have ever been shown. And you can just imagine the impact of these photographs. I can remember reading that Mallory took most of them himself, but the first time he put the photographic plates and the camera back to front. So he insisted on going back to all the places he'd been just to take them again. A bit further down the article, there's a subheading, Tribute to Dr. Kellis. This refers to the Scottish mountaineer Alexander Kellis, who was a member of the reconnaissance expedition. He was from Aberdeen, and he already had some experience of climbing in the Himalayas. He'd made 10 first ascents of peaks over 20,000 feet. But sadly, he died from a heart attack quite early on in the expedition. Mallory said they buried him in a spot chosen in sight of the 3 great mountains he had climbed, and with the top of Everest, his ambition, shining in the distance. Mallory went on to describe the challenges of the expedition. It took them 3 hours just to cross 100 yards of glacier. They ran short of rations, and then they had to walk in deep, soft snow, sinking up to their knees, so they had to wear snowshoes. They established a camp at 22,500 feet, and they intended to resume their efforts from that point the next season. He was talking in his lecture of the possibility of carrying oxygen cylinders. He said that at such high altitude, it would be effort enough to breathe, and to disturb the regularity of breathing might exhaust the party. They might be able to carry oxygen. Experiments had been made, and if the apparatus proved satisfactory, they should be able to get along well enough. I just love his casual optimism, typically British, isn't it really? They should be able to get along well enough. And so the 1922 expedition went ahead. The team established a new world climbing height of 27,320 feet. They were all pushing themselves beyond anything that anyone had experienced physically in terms of climbing. And it was towards nightfall one day, while George was coming back down, roped up to 3 other climbers, that one of them slipped. George immediately drove his ice axe into the ice, and it held, and he saved them. But during the final attempt on the summit, there was an avalanche which killed 7 of the porters, and George himself was nearly caught up in it. And he took it really badly. He felt that he was to blame for insisting on having another try. He wrote, "I would gladly at that moment have been lying there in the snow, if only to give those fine chaps the feeling that we had shared their loss, as we had indeed shared the risk." And after that, the whole expedition was abandoned. So after the 1922 expedition, Mallory came back to RSGS to give another series of lectures in November of that year. And meanwhile, another expedition was planned for 1924, and it was from this expedition that Mallory didn't return. He was the only person who had gone on all 3 of those early Everest expeditions. He'd wanted to be a professional mountaineer and writer, but sadly it didn't turn out like that. I also want to mention Mallory's climbing partner, Sandy Irving, because both men were lost on Everest together. They were seen for the last time in the far distance, making their way along the Northeast Ridge. Irving was only 22, and he had his own talents. He was a brilliant engineer. He could see how anything worked, and if it broke down, he could take it apart and mend it and put it back together. That's why he was so valuable with the early oxygen equipment that they were using. And out of interest, I remember being told by an RSGS member that Sandy Irving's brother, Thurston Irving, was a church minister here in Perth for several years. This photograph from RSGS collections shows George Mallory and Sandy Irving on the SS California. Mallory is on the far left, and Irving is second from the right. It was taken on the 29th of February 1924, just before they set sail from Liverpool to Bombay at the beginning of the 1924 expedition to Everest. The other 2 men are the mountaineers Bentley Beetham and John DeVars Hazard. We might never know whether or not Mallory and Irving did actually reach the summit of Everest, but it's a good time to remember their courage. Now I'm going to show you a signature in the RSGS Visitors book. which is one of the treasures at RSGS because it contains hundreds of signatures from visiting explorers right back from 1884 to the present day. This entry was made on the 15th of February 1951, and the visitor was Tor Heyerdahl. Heyerdahl was a Norwegian explorer, and you can see he's added the name Kon-Tiki. Below his signature is that of his wife, Yvonne. At that time, Heyerdahl was one of the world's most famous explorers because 4 years previously, he'd managed to sail a raft made out of balsa logs, a distance of 4,300 miles from Peru to the Tuamotu Islands in the Pacific. He'd built the raft himself with the help of his crew. It was crazy. Everybody told him he was mad. Several people had said he would die, but he managed to find 5 people to go with him, and they actually succeeded. So why on earth did he do it? It started in the 1930s when he had this dream about going back to nature. He was unhappy with the way the world was going. He was disillusioned with politics and the prospect of war in Europe. He cared deeply about wildlife and the environment. So he and his fiancée, Liv Torp, who was his first wife, planned to go and live on a Pacific island permanently and fend for themselves. It's simple as that. And it sounds like a reality show, really, but except that then there were no mobile phones, there was no internet and no means of communication. So they might just as well have been going to another planet. And they had to persuade both sets of parents that this was a good idea. But they did, and on Christmas Day 1936, which was the day after their wedding, they were dropped off on the island of Fatuhiva in French Polynesia. They still had their wedding clothes stashed away in a trunk on the beach. He said, that's not much use to us now, really. And they survived for a year. They realized, however, that it wasn't going to work out. So they were eventually rescued and came back to Norway. But something that Heyerdahl had been told there by the native islanders made him want to try something else. He'd been told by one of the chiefs that his ancestors had come from the east, suggesting South America. And this went against all the accepted theories at the time because it was thought that the islands were populated from the west. And so Heyerdahl decided to investigate. He went to Peru, where he found a legend that connected it all up. Somewhere back in the mists of time, a sun king called Kon-Tiki was attacked by a rival chief, and he escaped, and he and his followers set sail from the South American coast and disappeared off into the sunset. So Heyerdahl believed that it was all entirely possible. He researched the type of vessels that the early inhabitants of South America used. These had actually been seen by earlier European voyagers. They were big balsa wood rafts with a square sail. And he drew up a theory of how it all might have happened. And then he went to some anthropologists in America with his theory, but they scoffed at him. One of them said, sure, you see how far you get yourself sailing from Peru to the South Pacific on a balsa raft. But Heyerdahl wasn't put off at all. He said to one of his friends, I'm so sure that the South American Indians crossed the Pacific on their rafts that I'm willing to build a raft of the kind myself and cross the sea just to prove that it's possible. And that is exactly what he did. He took 5 men with him. They built the raft themselves out of balsa wood using only traditional materials. They called it the Kon-Tiki. And in every way, it was as close as possible to the boats of the indigenous people. They set sail from Peru on the 28th of April, 1947, and the Humboldt current carried them west, as he knew it would. And after 101 days, on the 7th of August, they reached French Polynesia. It was the most incredible achievement because no one knew how to navigate the raft. They knew what it looked like, but no one living had ever sailed one. So they had to learn as they went along, but within 2 weeks at sea, they knew that they could sail it, and they had the most incredible experiences. So Heyerdahl's vision had prevailed. he'd proved that it was possible that the Pacific Islands were populated from the east, not the west. And for the Kon-Tiki expedition, Heyerdahl was awarded the Mungo Park Medal by RSGS. Here's a photo of the presentation ceremony, which appeared in the Scotsman on the 16th of February 1951. Heyerdahl is receiving the award from Ian Bartholomew, the RSGS president. The article said, presenting the Mungo Park Medal to Mr. Heyerdahl, Mr. Bartholomew said that those who had read the Kon-Tiki book must have been thrilled by the courage of these hardy adventurers. So easily might the expedition have ended in tragedy, but it was not physical courage that they recognized alone in honoring Mr. Heyerdahl, but his persistence of purpose in following out a scientific quest. But that wasn't the end of the quest. The thing is that although Heyerdahl had proved it was possible that the islands were populated from the east, he had yet to prove that they actually were. So his theory was still not accepted at the time. But recent DNA analysis has suggested that around 1200 AD, there was some kind of contact between the people of Polynesia and South America. And meanwhile, he went on several more ocean voyages in different parts of the world, for which he built traditional boats and attempted to recreate what he believed were ancestral journeys. For me, though, the thing that stands out most about Heyerdahl is that he had a global vision. He always referred to the world's ocean, not oceans, because they're all connected. He recorded signs of pollution on his voyages, and he tried to get something done about it. He was wise, he was an early environmentalist, and he could see what mankind was doing to the earth. In the book about his year on Fatu Hiva, he says, "We have nowhere to retreat to, no choice, but to help one another to build a durable civilization in harmony with whatever natural environment we have left." And he also said, which is obviously the wisdom that he learned at first hand, one can't buy a ticket to paradise. You have to find it within yourself. Now, here's somebody I'd never heard of until I went into the RSGS archives. Baron Ferdinand von Richthofen. His name appears in a newspaper cutting from the Scotsman on the 7th of May, 1888. The short article was written by RSGS, and it says, "A premature announcement. The following is a copy of a letter received yesterday from Baron Ferdinand von Richthofen, the eminent geographer, whose death was reported last March in nearly all British and foreign newspapers. My dear sir, I learned that in March last, the Times, evidently by confounding me with a deceased near relation, has reported my death. As, just at the same time, I have ceased to get the issues of the journals of those British scientific societies to the membership of which I have had the honour to be elected, I may be pardoned if I suspect the latter fact to be connected with the first. Will you allow me, therefore, to beg you to re-establish me among the living members of your society and to let me again be the recipient of the Scottish Geographical Magazine, which has been to me hitherto of the greatest interest and value. The last number I got was that of March 1888. I hope to be able to introduce myself to you personally in August next. Believe me, my dear sir, yours faithfully, F. Richthofen." Now, first of all, I can't help but admire the elegance of phrasing here. I mean, what have we lost in the intervening 130 or 140 years? We've lost a lot in terms of expression. What would we do now in the same situation? Go to the website perhaps and click on manage subscriptions. It just makes me feel that we should be making more of an effort. But anyway, the name von Richthofen rang a bell. I immediately thought of the First World War fighter pilot who was a flying ace known as the Red Baron. But his name was Manfred von Richthofen, and the man we have here is actually his uncle, Ferdinand. Now, Ferdinand was a German geologist and a geographer, and between 1868 and 1872, he traveled extensively in China. In fact, he was considered to be the most widely traveled European since Marco Polo. He produced a book and detailed maps of his travels. A mountain range in Western China was named the Richthofen Range after him, although it's now known as the Chilean Mountains. However, he's best remembered for identifying a network of ancient trading routes which stretch right across Asia, which he named the Seidenstraßen, meaning Silk Roads. So it's Ferdinand von Richthofen who gave us the term Silk Roads. And he was true to his word. There's a happy ending here. His subscription was reinstated, and as promised, he did introduce himself personally to RSGS, because on the 21st of August of that year, his signature appears in the visitor's book. You can see it here, F. von Richthofen, Berlin. He held professorships in geography at the universities of Bonn, Leipzig, and Berlin, and he was president of the German Geographical Society. He lived for another 7 years, during which time he would have been enjoying the Scottish Geographical magazine on a regular basis. And by coincidence, the Richthofen range of mountains appears on this map, which was published in 1927, in a book entitled Through Jade Gate and Central Asia. The book is by Mildred Cable and Francesca French, and that brings me to the next explorers I want to tell you about. Because Mildred Cable and her friends Eva and Francesca French had all set sail from England individually at different times in the late 1800s and early 1900s to become Christian missionaries with the China Inland Mission in Western China. They each had a particular reason for going. They were all well educated, they came from respectable backgrounds, but in each case, something spurred them to do something very different with their lives. Mildred Cable was leaving behind a broken heart. Eva, who was the elder of the two sisters, was such a rebel and a daredevil as a young girl that her family really expected her to die at a young age. I mean, it was serious. She did these things deliberately, like walking along high parapets of buildings and across half-frozen lakes. And her family apparently agreed amongst themselves that they couldn't risk their own lives anymore in rescuing her, which was quite a radical decision to make. And Francesca, who was the younger sister, felt that she didn't fit in anywhere. And she naturally followed Eva to China a few years later. Now, what makes these ladies really interesting is that after a few years, they got bored with the daily life in the mission station. And so they all joined forces. They called themselves the trio, and they applied for permission to travel into the Gobi Desert, where there weren't any mission stations or any mission schools whatsoever. And there was a very good reason for this, because it was highly dangerous territory with warfare between different regions. And there was a very deep suspicion of foreigners who could be executed just for being there. Eva had already survived one brush with death. It was in the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. She'd been trapped inside a mission compound when a mob had come to murder them. But when she was escorted outside, no one dared to touch her. And she later learned that everyone thought she was carrying a pistol up her sleeve, but in fact, it was her Bible. So she really did have an exceptional knack for survival. So anyway, these three ladies, they did exactly what they said they would do. They traveled across the Gobi Desert with a horse-drawn cart full of Bibles, and they crossed the desert not once, but 6 times. Here's a photograph of Mildred from her book, The Gobi Desert, sitting on some bales of what looks like fleeces with camels all around her. It wasn't just about religion. They were offering a kind of sanctuary in the temporary schools that they set up. There was so much suffering, and they did their best to alleviate it. They ended up adopting an orphaned child who was deaf and mute. What earned them so much respect was that they spoke the languages fluently. They understood the culture because they had embraced that way of life entirely. They didn't think of themselves as explorers at all. Mildred Cable first came to RSGS in 1927 when she gave a lecture on her travels. Here's a news cutting from The Scotsman. It says, in the Gobi Desert, 3 women's experiences. And typically downplaying the dangers that they faced, she said, the greatest difficulty was lack of water. Owing to excessive heat, they were obliged to travel during the night. It took them 4 months to cross Turkestan, and they had many interesting experiences during that time. Well, that's an understatement, because at one point they were kidnapped by a warlord and imprisoned pending execution, and they basically had to talk themselves out of it. And the things that they saw, from Dunhuang, they passed through Jade Gate, which was a fortified gate in the Great Wall. They visited an oasis called the Lake of the Crescent Moon, which was known to Buddhist pilgrims as the side door of paradise. They were shown priceless jade carvings and beautiful ceramics buried away in the recesses of ordinary people's homes, literally kept under the mattresses. They climbed up the sand dunes known as the Singing Sands, and they discovered why they were called that, because if you slid down them, they made this weird loud noise like a musical instrument. And they were the first Westerners to visit the Western caves of the Thousand Buddhas. These were caves that had been excavated out of some cliffs at a key point along the Silk Road. They contained carvings of Buddhas and brightly painted murals dating right back to about the 4th century AD. Now, all three ladies came to RSGS in 1943 when they were awarded the Livingston Medal. They'd come back to Britain permanently before the Second World War. They lived in an idyllic little cottage in Shaftesbury. Mildred and Francesca wrote books, which became bestsellers, and they were touring around giving lectures. In their book, The Gobi Desert, Mildred gives us an idea of how much she missed China. She'd brought back home a little bottle of sand from the Singing Sands because she'd been told that the sand would sing anywhere, but she couldn't make it sing. And she'd pressed a flower between the pages of the book, which she'd gathered from the desert, but its scent was fading. She wrote, "Sick with longing, I walk among the crowds, while my spirit flees to the quiet which is found by the hidden lake among the dunes." And as for Eva, I'd like to think that she still had an appetite for danger. I can't quite believe that she settled down into a life of afternoon tea and parish council meetings in Dorset. I can just imagine her trying to hang glide off Kimmeridge Cliffs or something. And now here is another lady who was in love with the desert, Freya Stark. Freya had a lifelong obsession with the deserts of Arabia ever since she was a child, and she'd read the tales of the Arabian Nights. She first visited Damascus in 1928, and it was everything that she dreamed of. So she started planning expeditions, and Freya's idea of expeditions would take her way off the beaten track into dangerous and sometimes uncharted places. But unlike Mildred Cable and the Mrs. French, she wasn't evangelizing, she was just curious. One of Freya's first expeditions was a journey by mule out of Damascus to visit a tribe of people known as the Druze. They were a reclusive tribe, unpredictable, reputed to be hostile to strangers. The region was strictly off limits. It was under control of the French army. And Freya and her companion, Venetia Buddicombe, were captured by French soldiers. And instead of saying, "Sorry, we'll go home," they brazened their way out again, basically by pretending to be British tourists who'd got lost and were looking for a place that wasn't in their Thomas Cook brochure. So they made it to the Druze country, where they met the elders of the tribe and they actually talked to them. And it was all very friendly. Freya was enjoying it very much. She loved the adventure and she loved the risk. She was beginning to realize that she could talk herself into and out of lots of interesting places. And of course, she loved the history and the culture, and she enjoyed meeting people. Then a couple of years later, from Baghdad, she made a solo trek into a region known as the Valleys of the Assassins in the Elburz Mountains in modern-day Iran. She'd read in the travels of Marco Polo that the valleys held a number of ancient castles, all perched on rocky hilltops and rarely visited. They dated back to the 11th century, when a young Persian rebel named Hassan-i Sabah built a capital for his new sect. It was said that he inspired a fanatical sense of duty in his warriors. He invited them first into lush green gardens, and then he offered them the drug hashish. And when its effects wore off, They believed that they'd seen the gates of paradise, and they were ready to commit all kinds of murder on his behalf. And so the term Hashishin was born to describe them, or assassin as we know it today. So anyway, Freya went on a trek by mule up into the mountains, and she climbed up to 2 of the assassin castles. This is one of them, called the Castle of Almout. She was quite awestruck by the place. She explored the ruins. She went in the springtime, and she said there were loads of wild tulips growing there. It was beautiful. When Freya came to RSGS in December 1936, she was here to accept the Munga Park Medal, but she was also probably promoting her first book called The Valleys of the Assassins, because there's a publisher's leaflet about it in the archives. This is one of my favorite books by Freya. It's so candid, it's so full of the joy of traveling, full of curiosity, but she also accepted people as they were. She's a perfect combination, really, of determination to get somewhere she wanted to go, because she'd always find a way, and the ability to realize when she couldn't change situations or people. And also on this trip, she didn't have any unwanted companions, such as archaeologists, as she did on other occasions. Those particular expeditions didn't go very well at all, because she could be a very frustrating companion, and it was entirely mutual. In the preface to her book, she admits that she undertook the journey purely because she thought it would be fun. And she doesn't really make any apology about it. She says, "I know in my heart of hearts that it is a most excellent reason to do things merely because one likes the doing of them." The writings that came out of her adventures are beautiful, and she was traveling just at the time when these places were opening out and being more widely explored. She says, "Here was more than beauty. We were remote, as in a place closed by high barriers from the world. No map had yet printed its name for the eyes of strangers. A sense of quiet life, unchanging, centuries old and forgotten, held our pilgrim souls in its peace." Freya signed the visitor's book at RSGS, which you can see here, and she gave a lecture about her expedition. When she'd been awarded the Munga Park Medal, she thanked the Society for the honour and said she preferred to look on it as an encouragement rather than a recognition. She felt that she wouldn't deserve it until she'd done a great deal more. And she did do a lot more travelling. This was just the beginning, and she became a best-selling author as well. She came back several times to RSGS to give talks. She was a really popular lecturer. Now, here is an explorer and travel writer whose work I'm ashamed to say I'm only just discovering, Colin Hubbard. He is the most fabulous writer, but actually it's wonderful because now that I know how brilliant he is, I've got so many books to read. Colin Hubbard has been described as the preeminent travel writer of his generation. John Simpson, the former BBC reporter, said, "I would rather read Colin Hubbard than any other travel writer alive." He's won numerous literary awards, and he's actually an indirect descendant of the poet John Dryden. Throughout his lifetime of travel, he's focused largely on Asia. He's traveled widely in Russia and China and the Middle East. One thing that Hubbard has in common with Mildred Cable and with Freya Stark is that he allows himself to be absolutely absorbed into the country and the culture wherever he is. He speaks the languages fluently. He immerses himself in the history and the politics of the entire region. He's frighteningly well read, but there's so much he still doesn't know, and he will go to any lengths to visit obscure sites and to meet interesting but rather risky people and go to places where he really shouldn't be. And that's another characteristic that all these explorers have in common. For instance, and this appears in his book, Shadow of the Silk Road, which was published in 2006. Having just been released from a SARS quarantine compound on the southern edge of the Taklamakan Desert, where he'd been imprisoned, he was suddenly and unexpectedly released with no reasons given, and then basically told, just clear off. But no, there was a remote archaeological site that he wanted to see somewhere in the middle of the desert, and he risked missing the only bus, which wasn't the kind of bus that the word conjures up, in order to see it. So he was allowed to go there, and he saw some really curious archaeological finds, these 3,000-year-old burials with mummified remains, which are speculated to be people of Celtic descent because they were blonde and red-haired. It's interesting to understand why Colin Hubbard travels. He said once that travel was an addiction, but there's a revealing passage in his book where he's having an imaginary conversation with one of the ancient Sogdian people who traveled the Silk Road. The Sogdian asks, "What are you going for?" Hubbard replies, "For understanding, to dispel fear." What did you go for? To trade in indigo and salt from Khotan. Why should your understanding dispel fear, idiot? It's true, it may confirm it. Are you then afraid? I'm afraid of nothing happening, of experiencing nothing. That is what the modern traveler fears, forgive me, emptiness. Then you hear only yourself. And this idea of nothing happening actually made me think of one of Mildred Cable's books because it's called Something Happened. It seems spot on. Although with Mildred and Eva and Francesca, the something that happened was a definitive turning point in their lives that set them all on their path as missionaries. Colin Hubbard's path along the Silk Road actually follows that of Mildred Cable and her companions when he goes to explore the caves of the 1,000 Buddhas that they saw. He says, the only account I had read had been written 70 years ago by a pair of hardy women missionaries. But when he went there, a lot of it was fenced off and a lot of the murals had been defaced. And he was told that the treasury of silks that had once been there were long gone. And then a little bit later on in the Elburz mountains of Iran, he's following in the footsteps of Freya Stark when he visits the valleys of the assassins, and he climbs up a sheer cliff face to get to one of the assassin castles, very nearly killing himself in the process. He seems to take everything in his stride, and he's so dedicated to exploration that when he's there, nothing else matters. I mean, for example, in his book on the Silk Road, he's in Afghanistan, staying in what he calls a guest house. I mean, it was seriously not a guest house, guarded by Afghan soldiers. And he's just been told that there's a chance he could be flown to Herat. And because he's been there before and he has fond memories of the place, he's quite ecstatic. He says, Herat, 30 years ago in a time of peace, I had walked euphorically under its pines and minarets. I emptied my rucksack contentedly into my cell-like room. Its bulb was dimmer than the starlight. It had an iron bed and an Afghan rug, which for the moment was enough. Do you see what I mean? He's not really very demanding. And while he was in Iran, he was suffering from an abscess on his tooth, and he had to find himself a dentist. He was very dubious about the one he found, and for once he had problems with communication, but he couldn't wait any longer. He had root canal treatment without anesthetic. The book by Hubbard that I read first was The Amur River. It was published in September last year, and it's his account of his 3,000-mile journey along the entire length of the Amur River, which represents the border between Russia and China. He completed the journey in 2019 in his 80th year, and he was relying as usual on local guides, and some of whom he'd arranged to meet, some of whom he just came across and instinctively trusted. And it didn't really help that he was jolted off his horse pretty early on in Mongolia and hurt his ankle, and then shortly afterwards slipped and fell after bathing in a thermal pool and cracked some ribs. Hubbard has an unusual name, and he says that in China, he was often called Mr. Tubalong because it was hard to pronounce. Quite appropriate, really, because while he was there, he really did belong, even though he was seen as a bit of a curiosity. Because of his age, some of the people he met were quite protective of him, which he thought was mildly funny. So Colin Hubbard was awarded the Munga Park Medal in October 2000, when he attended an RSGS dinner at the Balmoral Hotel in Edinburgh. Here's a report from Jogscott, the RSGS newsletter, which was the forerunner of the Geographer. You can see him on the lower left there. He seems to embody the spirit of the award because it's traditionally given for exploration in potentially hazardous environments. So that's where I'd better put all these wonderful items back into their correct places. This is just a small sample of the kind of material and stories that are held in the archives of RSGS. When you think about it, the Society is still upholding the vision of John George Bartholomew and Agnes Livingston Bruce back in 1884, because they had this dream of welcoming explorers from all over the world. And it's so good because we can go into the archives and read about them. And I'd like, before I go, just to say a thank you to the RSGS collections team, who are the curators and guardians of all these treasures and are a vast repository of information themselves. I hope that you've enjoyed the talk, and thank you very much for tuning in.